Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Natalie Walker. I'm the manager of college operations here at the Classic Learning Test. For anyone unfamiliar with the CLT, we are a college entrance exam and assessment suite, now for grades 3 through 12. One thing that distinguishes the CLT as a test is its content. Most of the passages on any CLT exam come from our author bank. This is a list comprised of men and women who have contributed to the richness of philosophy and thought that we have inherited. They're authors you're likely to encounter in your college career, and hopefully you'll engage with them throughout your life. So most Thursdays of the academic year, and will continue through this summer, actually, to help us develop a true common canon, a faculty member from one of our partner colleges helps us explore one author or text from the CLT bank. Tonight, that text is the Magna Carta, and the partner bringing this seminar to you is Cairn University. Cairn is located in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. With about 1,500 undergraduate students, the campus is large enough to offer a broad cultural experience, yet small enough to provide a genuine community. Oftentimes, students and professors study, share meals, and fellowship, and become part of one another's lives during their time together. And in my experience, that's where an education really happens. With over 40 undergraduate programs, Cairn offers a unique academic experience built upon the conviction that all of life and learning belongs to God. Students study the liberal arts and their elected professional studies from a biblical perspective. And I just learned from Sean that all students graduate with a minor in biblical studies. We're lucky to have with us tonight Sean Maguire, an adjunct professor of politics at Cairn University, where he teaches classes on state and local government, U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. Supreme Court, the Constitution, and U.S. public policy. He studied at Liberty University School of Law and is licensed to practice as an attorney in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. His passion is for teaching, in addition to teaching the great college students at Cairn University. Sean also teaches at a Charlotte Mason Institute school in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. There, he is honored to teach 6 great high school students. In the time when he is not teaching, Sean enjoys traveling the world and spending time with friends and family. He also dedicates much of his energy to advocating on behalf of the unborn. There will be time after the lecture for questions, so keep yours close, and I will be fielding those from the chat, whether they are about Cairn or the Magna Carta. Thank you so much for joining us, Sean. We're so grateful to have you, and the screen is yours.
Thank you for having me, Natalie. The invitation was unexpected and really welcomed. When I saw the bank of authors, there were so many I wanted to choose from, and the top choices that I had already been snatched away. That's too bad. But I get to talk about Magna Carta, which is exciting. It was only, was it 2 years ago that the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. had a 1217 copy of Magna Carta on display in one of their temporary exhibits. And that was, for me, it was thrilling to go there and look at this document, and they had the Charter of the Forest there as well. And I was just super enthusiastic, really thrilled. And I took my high schoolers with me, and they were just kind of like, why are you looking at this old piece of parchment with Latin on it? We don't. I was like, come on, guys, this is history. But it's not so much the thing itself that's the most important. It's really the message in the words that's contained. I'm getting ahead of myself because I want to talk about that. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and I have a PowerPoint presentation. Now, this whole time, it's probably going to be talking under the level of the students. I don't know where we all are. I don't know what our understanding is. So I'm going to do a really basic exploration of Magna Carta, explain what it says, why it was signed, and how it's important. Then after that, we can definitely field questions about deeper topics, how it, anything that you guys want to talk about. And I know Natalie said you could talk about Cairn. I've been with Cairn University for 2 years, so if you ask me too much, I might not know. You can also ask me about teaching at high school. Ask me about law school if any of you have that on your radars. I'd love to answer questions about my law school experience. Or ask me anything else. I'm completely open to that. But for tonight, let's talk about Magna Carta and its impact on our world. So first of all, what does Magna Carta say? Let's see if I can get my slides to advance. There it is. Oh yeah, and just in case you forget what I look like while I'm showing my screen, there I am. and a little bit about me. One of my favorite things to say about myself is that I am an uncle to a lot of nephews and nieces. Currently, if I counted correctly, and my family's going to see this and they're going to correct me, I'm sure, 33 nephews and nieces who have been born. So that's my biggest role probably in all of my life. So what does the Magna Carta say? It's been around for a very long time. It was written in a particular form of Latin that was used at the time in the court, but is not widely known. And very few people today read it. There are those for the past few hundred years have been talking about the lack of education in constitutional law, the lack of understanding of these kinds of important documents from history. And one commentator back in 1858 he was selling his own constitutional law textbook, so he might be a little bit self-serving with this, but he says, Magna Carta, it's on everybody's lips, but in nobody's hands. Those who are talking about it from ignorance of its terms and agreements. And he talks about how the only thing we really seem to know is that it kind of is for trial by jury, and it's against arbitrary taxation. And that's about it. Most people have never read Magna Carta. It is 63 articles long, the original 1215 copy of Magna Carta. It was written in this weird ancient language, but all of those clauses, 63 of them, only 4 of them apply today. The rest of them have been repealed. The rest of them were about very specific grievances that might have existed at that time. And when those people had their grievances redressed or had passed, they were no longer relevant. So only 4 of them still are operable in British law today. And one of them is partial. So 3.5 of the clauses of 63 still exist. And like I said, written, nobody I know knows how to read the Latin that it's written in. So we all depend on these translations. It is a short document, those 63 articles. It's just under 4,000 words long, which is a little shorter than the US Constitution. But it's not well known. And if you do look up a translation and read it, I encourage you to have a really good dictionary with you, because even the English translations, they use all of these old British terms that you might need to look up and understand what it's saying. But what does it say? One of the main passages of the Magna Carta is called the Golden Passage. The Golden Passage are 2 of the clauses that still operate today, clause 39 and 40. And I will put that text up. It says, no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. Now, the we in that clause is King John and his court. It starts out with King John saying, these are all of the things I promise to do for the people. And it goes on, to no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. This is the most famous clause from Magna Carta. This is the one that is depended upon for so many things. Throughout history, throughout the 807 years of its existence, this clause is the one that's most mentioned, most relied on. It's a powerful message, and it establishes this as a promise from the king to his people. And every time I'm using that word people, I'm putting a little asterisk on it, because it doesn't mean precisely what we think of when we think of people. Right now it says no free man. What is a free man? Any person that's free, right? Any human being who's free. That's not probably what they meant by that. The nobles, the barons, the knights, they were free men. The serfs, the peasants, the villein, as they were known, if they weren't free serfs or free peasants, able to leave their land, this promise doesn't apply to them. This is a limited and narrow application. The Magna Carta was between the king and his barons and knights. That's the main focus. And also clause 1, which is still operable in part, is the Church of England. The Church of England has protections, and the freemen of England have protections, but the majority of the population, it didn't really impact or affect them. So the main impact of Magna Carta was articulated by this judge in England in 2000. So this is a recent quote. It's 23 years ago that this quote is from, and I think it's recent. But in terms of Magna Carta, it's a recent quote. In brief, Magna Carta means this, that the king is and shall be below the law. Now, the idea of a monarch being subjected to the law is an idea that may have existed in some communities and some cultures in different times in antiquity before 1215, but it had never been written down. Magna Carta is the first document that establishes this principle, that the law is over the monarch. Monarchs are not absolute rulers that can do whatever they want. They must submit themselves to the law as well. That's the main impact of Magna Carta. Now, with that as the main impact, it does seem a little odd that a king would sign such a document. So the question I have is, why would King John sign the Magna Carta? And if you've heard the rhymes or heard the story, you know that he signed it at Runnymede in 1215. He was there with his barons, and it wasn't exactly a free choice from King John. The barons were not there peacefully discussing a question with him. The barons were there threatening war. The leader of the barons was threatening that if King John would not agree to these 63 clauses, then they would go to Windsor Castle and they would tear it down stone by stone. One of the clauses of Magna Carta is that the barons, 25 barons, get to decide if the king is keeping the other 62 clauses. And if they decide that he's not, then what's going to happen is everyone in the realm is going to distress the king and disturb his properties, even to the point of tearing down Windsor Castle and removing him from the throne and putting someone else in his place. It's not a great document for the king. So what led him to this? Well, it was the threat of force. One commentator described it as he was frog-marched to Runnymede and forced to sign it against his will. And he certainly felt that he was under pressure and didn't have a free choice in signing the document. So let's talk about all of the players that are involved, this cast of players way back in 1215, 807 years ago in June. The anniversary is coming up, by the way, so I hope you're all ready to celebrate the 808th anniversary of Magna Carta coming up next month. So first of all, there's King Richard the Lionhearted. No, not the Disney version. Although if you have seen Robin Hood, the animated version, which is probably the best version of Robin Hood, he's in there, King Richard the Lionhearted. He was King John's brother, and King John inherited the throne when King Richard passed in 1199. So King John was a probably brilliant king. He was excellent at administering the country. However, he was really unlucky. When he took the throne, he almost immediately lost some lands in France. And he undertook military action to try to reclaim them. In order to raise the army, he had to raise the taxes. And all of his military campaigns failed. And he continued to raise taxes and impose new orders of taxes and new types of taxes on his barons and knights in order to try to retain and try to take back those properties. In addition to being skilled at administering the kingdom, as far as the administration goes, he was ruthless, aggressive. He was an unpleasant man, and some people say he was unstable. He may have been mentally unstable, and he was very unlucky in just timing. Things did not go well for King John in the history books. The other group, the main antagonists of King John, were the barons, this group of nobles who were frankly just fed up and sick of his imposition of multiple levels of taxation. The burden was extreme. The enforcement was aggressive. King John was giving orders to his commissioners to take the taxation by force rather ruthlessly, which is where the legend of Robin Hood comes from, the Sheriff of Nottingham being really ruthless in the execution of these taxes. So the barons were threatening King John with war. In fact, they did disavow their loyalty to King John and threatened to put someone else on the throne by force. In order to avoid that, they offered a list of demands, which are now known as Magna Carta. This was essentially their terms of peace. It was a peace agreement between King John and the rebellious barons to end the Civil War. Now, there's another character I want to introduce, who's Stephen Langton. Stephen Langton is the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time. However, King John really didn't want Stephen Langton to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he fought against Pope Leo III to prevent that installation. Eventually, he did lose, but in the meantime, Pope Innocent had imposed strong sanctions against England. He had excommunicated King John. He had prevented wedding ceremonies from being performed in the islands. It was a very difficult season. And eventually King John capitulated to the Pope, and Stephen Langton was installed as Archbishop. So King John didn't really like Stephen Langton, but the barons trusted him. And so in the end, Stephen Langton became one of the chief negotiators between the barons and King John into coming to terms of peace in this conflict, in this civil war. So Stephen Langton's a name to remember, Archbishop of Canterbury. There at Runnymede, when the Magna Carta is signed, Stephen Langton's presence helps to convince the king that it's necessary and proper to do so. Almost as soon as King John had signed the Magna Carta, he appealed to Pope Innocent III and said, I was forced to do this, basically, and it's not legal, and it can't be enforced. We can't subject kings to barons and subject them to the law. That's not right. The king should be ultimate. And Pope Innocent III agreed. He looked at the Magna Carta and he declared it illegal. So he issued his papal bull that declared the Magna Carta was null and void, and that was in 1216. So the very next year, the Pope is declaring that Magna Carta is unenforceable. It's an illegal action of rebellion, and rebellion is a sin against God and the Church. Now, that would be the end of Magna Carta if things didn't progress how they did. Like, once Pope Innocent III declares it illegal, there's really no force to it anymore. It would be a footnote in most history books today, even if it was mentioned at all. But that's not what happened. And so I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. As soon as Pope Innocent III did declare Magna Carta illegal, the barons revolted. They had barely been convinced to have peace when King John agreed to sign the Magna Carta, and as soon as it's declared illegal, war breaks out. So English Civil War ensues, and it's fought between the barons and King John, but King John dies in late 1216, not 2016, 1216. And he dies of dysentery, but some historians look at it and they say he may have been poisoned. We don't know for sure. His infant son is then crowned, and the kingdom is placed under the guardianship of a steward. And when I say infant, he's under age of maturity, but he wasn't like a baby. So King Henry III is under the steward, and he's convinced that this civil war that's raging between the barons and the throne, it has to come to an end. The barons had even gone so far as to invite the King of France to take the throne of England. And so there's a real threat that English autonomy is going to be lost, that France is going to take over. And Henry III reissues Magna Carta. There's a few clauses that are changed. Some of those clauses had already been addressed. The grievances have been solved. So a few clauses are different, but Henry III reissues Magna Carta. Same time, he reissues the Charter of the Forest, which is another very important document for English rights in the common lands and the king's lands. So those were issued in 1217. This ends the Civil War. The barons swear fealty to Henry III, and England is preserved. Now, after Henry III, every subsequent monarch has reissued Magna Carta. It is part of British common law. It's part of British constitutional law. They don't have a written constitution, but they rely on Magna Carta and a few other documents that they depend upon as their constitution in their country. Throughout the hundreds of years since it was written, Magna Carta has been depended upon by various political movements. There are those who would critique the king, and like Sir Edward Coke would critique the throne and criticize George III. And George III, meanwhile, would pose with a picture of Magna Carta in his portrait. So he would say, this is Magna Carta, and it came from the king, and it's a proprietary property of the throne of Great Britain. We are the ones that have provided you with Magna Carta. And meanwhile, his critics are publishing newspaper prints under the heading of Magna Carta. So both sides of political debates are using it. There were feminist historians and feminist authors who argue that Magna Carta preserves the rights of women. When it says free men, it says the Latin term home, then that means women too, and Magna Carta must be applied to women. Magna Carta has been relied on even recently in the Philippines. There was a document written preserving the rights of women, and it's been nicknamed the Magna Carta of women in the Philippines. So this term Magna Carta is relied upon for centuries to describe the rights and protections of people from their government. I was looking up information about Magna Carta. I was doing a little research, and I found something from the British Library that surprised me. It has a timeline of significant dates in Magna Carta. And so I was like, okay, well, here we are, some of the things that I talked about. And then it keeps going. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And it goes into the 1600s with the English Civil War and the removal of Charles I. Magna Carta was often depended upon by those that were issuing petitions of rights. They would look back and say, Magna Carta establishes this, and we must fulfill that. And then it goes on, and this timeline mentions the Declaration of Independence in the United States and the US Constitution. I didn't know that they would put that on a timeline, but the foundations of Magna Carta about that principle that no one is above the law, the monarch is not above the law, these principles are core, they're central to our representative democracy, our constitutionally federated republic. There's this underpinning that comes from Magna Carta and the ideas that are enshrined there. It's tempting today to take for granted representative democracy. It's tempting to take for granted the rule of law rather than the rule of man. But that's not the way things were in history. Throughout human history, powerful and influential monarchs would do whatever they wanted. They would ignore their subjects and do what pleased them and serve their own interest. You would have good ones and bad ones, but they would be the absolute rulers. It's only in the recent history that we've had the rule of law, where the king is subject to the law, where the law is king, or lex rex. That's something that we should be grateful for. It's not the norm in human societies. It is the exception. And we have a rich legacy in our country going all the way back to Magna Carta. So that's really, really surface level. And I'm sorry that I probably told you a bunch of things you already knew and you already had heard, but I would like to just open up for questions because I like to respond. I like to do things more, not quite Socratically. I'm from a Charlotte Mason school at a high school level, so I like to read living texts and then just discuss them. So I'm hoping that we will have some discussion now. And like I said, you can ask me questions about Magna Carta, you can ask me about Cairn, you can ask me about anything at all.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, anyone can ask anything in the chat, and I'll go ahead and start. First of all, is this a text that you teach to your high school students?
Yes, we did read through, well, we didn't read the Magna Carta. We read some excerpts from it. Maybe we should read all of it, but that's a lot of words to define.
Right.
We definitely read the history of Magna Carta, the history of King John and his conflict with the barons.
Okay. So could you sort of orient us? I'm sure there are many ways one might find oneself thinking about the Magna Carta. But for you, do you think of it, what's kind of the context you think of it in? Just British history or kind of constitutional law in general? What texts does it pair well with, I guess?
Yeah, I think it pairs really well with the US Constitution. It's interesting to compare the two documents because they are both written. I should re-emphasize that the Magna Carta wasn't an agreement that was just verbal. It was written down, and that enabled it to be published more broadly. Copies of it were sent to all the counties, to all the bishops of England at the time, and then subsequent publications got broader and broader and broader, and it's spread across the whole world now. In the lead up to World War II, Britain was eager to print copies of Magna Carta and send them to the United States, who they were very much hoping would be a strong ally in the pending conflict. They actually commissioned a free program where any school in the United States could request a copy and would get one, paid for by the crown. So its publication is important. Again, comparing it with the Constitution, they're both written on parchment, they're both a similar length, but the similarities kind of fall apart there. Magna Carta is not a fundamental rule of order. It's not a description of how a government should operate. It's a peace treaty. It's a peace treaty between King John and rebellious barons who were sick and tired of his taxation. But the principle from Magna Carta about the rule of law and the authority of law over a king, and the principle that even lesser nobles or lesser magistrates could be imposed upon to protect the people from the higher authority, those are principles that are very strongly echoed in the United States. So Thomas Paine's Common Sense and all of these publications leading up to the War of Independence, these are appealing back to the English Civil War that had just occurred, but even further back looking at Magna Carta and the principle contained therein.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there any language, either just in the Golden Passage that we looked at or anywhere in the Magna Carta that you find really interesting or that surprises you at all?
So in law school, I was doing property law, and a lot of the issues in Magna Carta are property disputes, property conflict between barons and knights, and the succession of their property, if they pass, who gets the land, and all of these issues. So that was actually a little bit of a surprise that so much of it is property law. The one word that keeps on coming up is fee, F-E-E, fee. And it's a term that I have only ever encountered in law school and in the Magna Carta. And so that was kind of fun as far as language being stumbled upon unexpectedly in the Magna Carta itself. The rest of the time, it's honestly, sometimes it's just a bit of a struggle to say, what is this even saying? I don't understand.
Yeah.
But on the other end, the language that is really exciting is the language of how much the Magna Carta, especially the start, it depends upon and relies upon the authority of God. And it starts out with appeals to God and understands that these agreements are made in the name of God. Now, it kind of weakened because nobody kept the agreement and nobody really expected the agreement to be kept. barons didn't trust John, and John was feeling compelled to do it at the time. So it kind of makes their oaths a little bit,
Right.
yeah, but the language is there, and that's, kind of nice.
Yeah. Could you tease out, yeah, why were the barons going to be satisfied with writing this down?
Yeah, so their conflict with the king was, there is the principle that the king's under the law. It exists prior to Magna Carta in the common law of the nation, but there's nothing to enforce it. And King John had simply ignored all of the rules that were established about taxation. He had gone his own way. He had done his own thing in order to finance these costly and disastrous conflicts in France. And the barons wanted to make sure that he would understand. You can't just do that. You can't just do whatever you want, and get away with it. We're going to hold you to account. So amongst all of the clauses, the second and last one, 62nd, is the one that establishes that this council of barons who can hold the king accountable. That's really probably the most important clause for the barons at the time, to know that they would have surety, they would have security to ensure that these terms would be enforced. Because already King John had ignored other terms, he had ignored other agreements and done what he wanted. And so having the Council of Bishops established, which is a precursor for Parliament, this allows them the opportunity to restrict the power of the king, hold the king accountable, and protect their own interests. Now, it was the interests of the bishops only. They weren't there looking out for the rights of the people. They weren't establishing a principle of democracy. They weren't establishing a principle of one man, one vote. That's not at all what was in their minds. Their minds were our jurisdiction, our dominions in the realm. We want to protect them, and we don't want the king to just call upon us time and time and time again, taxing us beyond our capacity to pay, and then throwing us in prison if we don't pay our taxes. We want to be protected from the king, but they weren't looking for anyone else. It was just themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's very helpful. There's a question in the chat that I might need a little follow-up with, because I think probably referring to something very specific that you said, and I'm not sure which part. They're asking, what are the other two clauses?
Oh, yes. Yeah, so 4 clauses are still operable. Yes, that's good. So the two most famous are the Golden Passage, and those are fully operable in British law today. So the Crown, the government, is not going to use force against individuals without trial. It's really trial by jury is a part of it. They're not going to sell justice, which biblically is one of those things that God hates. And the other one is the first one, partial, which protects the rights of the Church of England. They will not be imposed upon. And then the other one is the 13th clause, and that refers to London and other cities and towns, protecting their established rights and practices in those cities and towns. So those are the 4 that are still operable. So London's been around for a very long time, and it's always had this special place.
Yeah.
It's mentioned by name in Magna Carta. So there you go.
Huh. Very neat. So if you had a high school class or college that you were reading this text with, yeah, what are some questions that you would be posing to your students?
Well, the Charlotte Mason question is, tell back what you've read.
Right.
What did you hear from it? What did you read in it? I don't know what kind of response that would generate when so much of the language is just very, very tough. But I would ask more difficult questions, well, more draw out some discussion from this passage and ask questions like, well, the question that I want to ask people is what happened before the Golden Passage was enshrined? What happened before the king promised not to do those things and guaranteed that he wouldn't be selling justice? And do you think it's a good thing that this is written down? What impact does it have to be written down? Yeah, those kinds of questions. I think it's important for us to think about the impact of Magna Carta even today. It's 800 years old, but what would it be like to live in a society where that wasn't written down, where there was no Magna Carta? Do we expect that every single government official would be a tyrant and do what they wanted? Probably not, but it would be a possibility, maybe. What kind of changes does that have?
Yeah, it is so interesting to think about the force of writing, because like you were saying, there is something, you know, almost circular about the king making an oath, and of course he's the one that's going to have to keep it. So it's an oath that's sort of above himself, but it's still on his authority. But there's something about, yeah, the written word. Yeah, what is the force of that? It would be embarrassing to contradict yourself, I guess, when something's been written down. We have a question in the chat. How do you suggest reading and learning documents such as the Magna Carta with such tough verbiage and relating to definitions of the terms that may be different today? Is taking it in small sections easiest, or what else is your advice?
Well, get a dictionary, have a dictionary with you. Certainly, you know, as you read anything at all, if you come upon a word that you don't know the meaning of, look it up. See what the definition is from a dictionary. And note that the Magna Carta is being translated. So it's not always using the very oldest of terms, but sometimes it is. I would read through Magna Carta or the Constitution, which is also at this point kind of an old document. Read it with a dictionary, and then go beyond that if you have more questions about its meaning, to look at some of the sources who are translating it, some of those who are working as scholars in this field. A lot of them have published treatises on the topic online, and they're available for us to read for free. So if a specific clause catches your attention, look into this. Go to the British Library and search for Magna Carta documents that can help explain to you the meaning of that term. And look up that clause from, you know, works of public opinion throughout the history. Have other people relied on those clauses and argued the definition of those clauses. There will be different ways to interpret this. As I pointed out, King George III and Sir Edward Coke are both relying on Magna Carta at the same time, and they have very different ideas about how government should operate. Feminists use it. I saw one argument that Magna Carta was the beginning of the end of European civil order. It was the disaster for all of human rights, and I was just kind of baffled by that argument. But there are those that would argue Magna Carta enshrines a kind of patriarchal system of land ownership is always held in the hands of the lords and the people are cut off from it. And it was a bad document for those reasons. You know, I would look at that and say, well, I don't think that the status quo was any better. The people didn't have access to the lands. Look at the Charter of the Forest from 1217, and you'll see they would be penalized brutally sometimes for foraging in the woods, or trying to get lumber for their fires or their homes, or trying to kill wild game on the Crown's land, which took up a third of southern England. So reading through these documents that are prone to a lot of interpretation, I think the main thing is to make sure that we have ourselves read them. We will be hearing so many interpretations and so many applications. And if we haven't read it ourselves with a good dictionary to help out, we'll be without a response, without a way to answer those who would say, oh, it means this. It's not the Bible, but the Bible does come to mind. You hear the Bible applied and interpreted in so many different ways. And if you're not familiar with it, you don't have a way to respond or answer. So that's the first part, is I would say, just read it and you get what you get. If you get a lot, you get a lot. If you get a little, you get a little. Start there and then move forward if you have more questions.
That's great. Would you have any special advice or reading suggestions for a student that's thinking about law school, perhaps after college?
Well, if you're going to go into law school, my advice for you on the Magna Carta is the same. Read it, get what you get from it. Read through it, look up words you don't know. If you're really interested in specific clauses, absolutely look up anyone who's written on that and find explanations of it. There are also lots of books that explain Magna Carta and talk about all of the terms in the document itself and give some explanations of it. I listed the quote from the author from 1858, so that might be a little old, but he was writing a document about English constitutional law, and Magna Carta was a particular text he would examine. So you can certainly read texts on Magna Carta's meaning. If you're looking to go to law school, my best advice for you is read. It doesn't matter much what it is that you're reading. I hope you're reading good texts, but read a lot. Just read a lot and get used to reading a lot, and that will help you immensely. I would actually advise against one type of text. Don't read law prep books. They're probably not worth your time. Just read books that you think are valuable and worth reading. Read the classics. If you haven't read them all already, which you haven't because nobody has, read classics and just make sure you're reading a lot, because that's what law school is going to be.
Yeah. That's great. We have a question in the chat from Patrick, and he's asking if you could talk a little bit about how you change your approach when you're teaching this with high school students versus college students.
So my approach would be different because in high school, I'm teaching at a Charlotte Mason Institute school. So that's going to be different. In college, I'm teaching at an accredited educational institution. It's going to have different rigors applied to it and different expectations. I do try to set before the college students a great banquet of information and encourage them to explore it on their own. That being said, in college, I'm able to push back a little bit harsher in college because they're there of their own volition, and I'm able to press them and say, this is what you have chosen to pursue, so pursue it wholeheartedly, push forward. What's the purpose of being here if you're not going to press yourself and try to learn and grow, being intentional with your time and your energies? So in college, I'm kind of the harsh professor who says, why are you here if you're not doing the work in order to learn and grow? And why are you learning and growing? I mean, the only reason to learn and grow and acquire new knowledge is in order to use it to serve someone else. That was one lesson I learned in law school, is that it doesn't matter how much we know about the law. It only matters what we say and what we write and what we do. Until we actually apply it, it's not going to help anyone how much we know. And I hope that my college students, and I do encourage them and impress this upon them, are learning for the purpose of serving others, to take information, to take all of these readings, to do the writing and then listen to the feedback and response from the professor and apply that in a way that they will be able to serve others better. I impress the same language lessons on my high schoolers, but it's not as forceful, I would say. I'm a little bit more gentle with my high schoolers. They are not there by choice. And many of them aren't going into higher education. They're not interested in going into the academics, which is great. Many of my high schoolers are going into the mechanical fields. There's one who's going to be an artist. They have a lot of different dreams. And I'm like, that's fantastic. And don't go to school if you're not going for a very specific reason. Here I am representing a university and telling people they probably shouldn't go to school. But Cairn University knows this about me. So, and they still retain me. So that's good.
That's says a lot about them. Only good things. Yeah, do you have advice, kind of questions you might recommend a high school student asking themselves as they're thinking about their future and their college decision? Maybe let's take an example where a student is interested in academics, or at least they think they want to go on to higher education. Yeah, what sort of questions should they be asking about the places they're considering?
The questions that I was encouraged to ask as I looked into law school specifically, I think are applicable, and I think they're good questions. It's more and more the case that whatever you're going to be learning in college, you can get the same texts, the same books, the same resources, the same videos from a lot of different places. The thing that's not going to be the same are the people. Who's teaching you? Who are the people there that are going to be instructing in these classes and these courses? Look at the teachers, look at the professors, look at the doctors, look at the administrators even, but look at the culture of the place more so than the academics. The academics can be very, very similar in a bunch of different locations. Not all of them. At law school, it pretty much is the same. The law is the law. It's taught pretty much the same way in every law school. It's more important to look at the professors. And if you have professors who are going to genuinely care about you and your goals and your aspirations, choose them. Choose them first. It's going to be the best way to choose an institution to study at. That would be my advice. And then my second piece of advice is, until you're really, really sure that you should be pursuing higher education, don't. There's nothing wrong with going and getting a job. In fact, I encourage that. I had somebody recently ask me about law school. They're like, what should I do over the summer? I'm planning to go into law school. So should I get a legal internship? And I was like, I have my ideas, but let me ask more broadly. And I reached out to my colleagues on our group page from my class from law school. And I asked them, and they said, the overwhelming advice was, get a job. Get a job in manufacturing or blue collar work of some kind. It will teach you a number of things. Well, first, you'll make a little bit of money, which is very helpful. But second, you'll be productive, and it will teach you time management skills and interpersonal skills. And you'll learn about the work and the occupations of maybe a number of your clients in the future. You'll have a real world way to understand the conflicts that might be arising that you could be dealing with as an attorney in years to come. And I think that's fantastic advice. Law school will teach you the law. You can go and go to an internship at a law firm. You're not going to learn the law as an intern in a law firm. You might learn how to make coffee really well. You might learn some other things and skills. But if they try to teach you the law, it's probably not going to stick, and it's going to be something that you're going to have to unlearn later on, something that you learned incorrectly earlier. So don't try to just, jump ahead and do that, but apply yourself where you can with the skills and abilities that you already have to serve your neighbors and to be productive and make good use of your time, even in preparation for something different in the future.
Yeah, that's very, very good. We have a little bit of time left, and I wanted to be sure we had time for you to describe a new program at Cairn that you mentioned to me earlier. I don't want to get the name wrong. At
That's
Politics,
okay.
History, and Philosophy, something like this.
So yeah, that's great. We actually at Cairn University, and I've been with Cairn for 2 years as an adjunct professor. But when I was brought on, it was largely because they had a greater need and a greater demand for teachers of politics and government, and as well as constitutional history and Supreme Court history, which is my favorite class, by the way. Absolutely. I went to law school. I studied the Supreme Court cases. I love the Supreme Court history and looking at that and the Constitution alongside of it. So that was a great class. I really look forward to teaching that again. I don't have it this semester, which is too bad. But they brought me on because they were having a growth in students seeking a politics major. Big part of that might have been the increased awareness of state government, the increased awareness of government involvement in the daily interactions with citizens. I know during the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion going on in the broader culture about government regulations, government decisions that were being made at various levels. And I think a lot of people ask themselves, oh, well, who's in charge and why are they in charge and how can I get involved in order to make decisions and serve the community in this way that's very, very impactful. So they saw the impact of government more and more, including amongst those in the church, with churches having COVID restrictions on gathering. So there was an increased demand for that degree. And at the same time, Cairn has been teaching history and philosophy and politics. And so they kind of put them all together and invited a full-time faculty member, Steele Brand. He's from another academic institution. He's coming on board at Cairn University. He's designed a politics, philosophy, and history degree. So the politics, philosophy, and history program is going to take those three core ideas and demonstrate through the education, demonstrate how they are connected and how they interact with one another. I'm really excited for it. I saw the library that's being installed with all of the books on the shelf, and I was looking at those books and I was like, oh my goodness, I'm very excited about this. Many of them I had read, some of them I had not, especially on the philosophy side. I'm much weaker in that area. And I'm really excited to read more excellent books and to discuss the interaction between those three subjects and how we can take that and apply it in a way that will better our communities and serve our neighbors well.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, maybe this is the last question before we go, but yeah, what are some books, authors, whichever direction you want to take it, that have most influenced you, maybe especially if any got you interested in politics or law or history specifically?
That's a good question. I mean, thinking about Magna Carta, I've been thinking about Robin Hood, and I've been thinking about King John, Richard the Lionhearted. I've been thinking of medieval era stuff. I don't know why I got involved or interested in law and politics. It's not in my family. There's no history of it. I wasn't reading political treaties growing up. I wasn't really concerned about this, but in high school at some point, I did really start to get interested in it. And if I had to say what I think it was, and maybe it's just because I'm thinking about that subject right now, but I think Stephen R. Lawhead is an author, and he writes fantasy fiction, historical historical fiction. He wrote a series about Robin Hood. He wrote a series about this kind of Celtic mythological unity. And in his books, he talks a lot about the decisions being made by the authorities, by the rulers, by the kings or the lords or the nobles or whatever. And I haven't read them in a very long time. But in the past few weeks, they've been coming to my mind, and I've been remembering, oh yeah, these decisions were made. And I remember thinking that was not a good way to respond. So maybe that's where my passion and desire came from. was from fiction stories about the impact of rulers on the subjects. So I don't know why that has been coming to my mind more and more in the last few weeks. And it's hard for me to pinpoint where my desire shifted, because once I started to desire to go into politics, I started reading Robert's Rules of Order for fun and during high school. And my family was just like, what are you reading? What even is this? And I was just like, it's so great. It's parliamentary procedure, and it just makes so much sense to have order in our meetings. I read like really boring, dry texts, and I think they're exciting and exhilarating. So that's me. But I also read fantasy and fiction, and that makes me passionate as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, this hour has made me think a lot about Shakespeare's Richard II, which has come up in the past couple seminars that we've had. That would be a nice application of Magna Carta sort of questions and thinking.
Nice.
It's been such a pleasure to listen to you and talk to you. And thank you so much for your time, Sean. Really
Thank you for having me, Natalie. I'm glad you mentioned Richard II. I actually am thinking about what Shakespeare play we'll do at Charlotte Mason school, at my school next year. So yeah, I'll have to look at Richard II. Maybe that will be it. Thank you for having me.
Not such a famous one, but that's actually a little bit fun too. The life and death of King John. Thank you all for joining us on the call as well. Good night, everyone.
Good night.